Hi everyone, Nemo here. Welcome back to the channel. Today I am joined by a guest who actually we should all know quite a lot more about. It is Kris Mace who takes us through every year the analysis of the church's finances. Kris, how you doing?
Hello, yeah, nice to be on. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. Would you like to just tell everyone a little bit about who you are, what you do, why you're involved in this?
Yeah, I grew up as an active member of the church, and probably sort of 10, 12 years ago, I became aware that the church has to produce a financial report each year for the British Charities Commission. And just out of intrigue, really, I started downloading it, having a flick through the numbers, and kept track of the data that they have to release for transparency. So just information such as the total amount of donations, what those donations are in terms of any particular sort of pots and which areas they've been donated to. There's also a bit of information in the report about the membership numbers each year, so number of members, number of baptisms, wards branches, etc. And just out of personal interest, really, I've just kept track of that for a number of years. It sort of became interesting, really, after 5 or 6 years when you could start to see some trends, and there's been a little bit of discussion on Reddit in the past and some quite major threads, really, as people have taken this information. It is quite interesting and almost exciting, because there's not really many countries that do release this sort of information, and some of the trends have been really interesting over the last sort of 10 years, which we'll get into, I think.
I'm sure. And can you just tell us a little bit more about what the report is, just what it is, why they have to file it?
Yeah, well, I'm not a complete expert on this whole process, but any charity in the UK is obviously eligible for certain sort of benefits and tax breaks, and they have to justify their position as a charity and why they are eligible for all those benefits. And as a result of that, they have to produce, and this is every charity in the UK, has to produce a report each year on the purpose of the charity, the donations they're taking, and how they've spent it. And you can look that up on the Charities Commission website for any charity you name. So, Cancer Research, Shelter, there's reports there for every single charity in the UK, and that's a legal obligation.
You've been collating this data together, and you very kindly sent me that spreadsheet, which we'll put in the description so people can see the trends for themselves and have a good route through it. But you produce a summary, don't you, each year?
Yes, yeah. So each year, I mean, the report is normally sort of 60, 70 pages. This year, it was over 100 pages. So there's a lot of information there. A lot of it's not really very, very relevant. So I've tried each year to just sort of narrow it down to a few brief sort of headings that summarize the main things that I'm seeing. And some of that is individual to each year, and some of that's more based on trends that I've seen over a number of years. So yeah, there were a few things sort of this year that I noticed in particular. The report came out last week, and it's for up to the 31st of December 2020. So obviously 2020 was a disrupted and a significant year. So I was quite anticipating, what this report would say.
And do you think that's why the report was longer?
No, I think it seemed to me to be longer. I think the government have added some extra information that needs to be put in,
Okay.
compared to previous reports. So it seemed to be padded out by some
Right.
extra legal things the church needed to put in.
I think with that, we'll go straight into this year's report. We're gonna discuss some of your main takeaways. What are your main takeaways from this? What are your points?
Yes, so unsurprisingly, baptisms were down quite significantly. They've been falling for a number of years anyway, but then I think with the pandemic having obviously an impact on the ability of the missionaries to do their normal work, baptisms were about half what they were in 2019.
And that's consistent with the sort of global rates, isn't it?
But I would think so. Yeah, I've not really looked at
So the global
what's happening in other
statistics show a
countries.
49% across the entire church. They show about a 49% decrease in convert
Right. So
baptisms.
yeah, that's it's almost exactly half what it was in 2019. So that's pretty much bang on with every other country then. But the longer trend is that if you look over 10 years, baptisms have dropped by nearly 80%,
Really?
which I'm sure the church is quite worried about. So back to 2009, there were 2,500 baptisms in one year, and last year there were under 500. So that's quite a significant drop.
Yeah.
And like we said, COVID's obviously had an impact on that, but that's still a huge fall.
Because what was it in 2019?
2,500, so 2,533.
So
Oh,
sorry.
sorry, in 2019, 990.
1994. So
55. So
it's
yeah,
still half what it was 10 years ago.
it's still half what it was 10 years ago,
Yeah.
even pre-COVID.
Yeah. Because I mean, you kind of almost have to eliminate some of the COVID statistics in a sense from some of these trends because it's an anomalous result.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But still, that's it's halved almost over almost 10 years. And wasn't this the decade where we went to double church attendance?
Yeah. So yeah, I do remember the goal of doubling church attendance.
The Europe area plan,
2010 to 2020. Yeah, doesn't seem to have come to fruition.
Don't think so. Okay, so what's your next takeaway?
The next one was the number of members. Now, this is obviously a bit of an odd statistic because the number of members in the UK is, astronomically sort of unrelated to how many bums are in seats on a Sunday. So officially, there's 186,000 members of the church in the UK. We know from sort of previous data that's leaked that there's actually less than 30,000 active.
Right.
But what I've sort of seen over the last few years is the number of members has been sort of plateauing and even sort of falling some years. So just looking back over the last few years, some years it's gone up by 200, some years it's gone down by 500. Last year was the biggest drop that's ever been, so it dropped by almost 1,500 in 1 year, the total number of members.
And that's members of record, regardless of whether they come to church or not. That's that. Wow.
Yep.
Okay. What do you think's caused that, in your view?
I think it's probably a few things. I think it's probably having half the number of baptisms there was in 2019 will have had an impact. I think there probably is more of a high proportion of older people at church than maybe there was 20, 30 years ago, and I think they're probably starting to some of the members that were baptized in the 60s and 70s are probably starting to die.
And quite a lot of elderly folks have been killed by COVID.
Probably. Yeah, that as well will have had an impact. Yeah.
So how would you? We're not going to do the maths live on air, but how would you think that we would determine how many of those were deaths and how many of those were, people leaving or resigning?
I think it's impossible to really work that out because we don't really know how they've calculated that. So we've got baptisms going in. The church haven't told us how many children of record were blessed because they will go in as well. There will be some resignations from that. That number going out, and then deaths. It's hard to know.
I mean, you could look at deaths as a population percentage here in the UK, and then almost kind of extrapolate that to the church data. But the church's demographic isn't representative of the whole UK demographic, so it would be almost impossible.
I think I've tried to do that before, and the problem is because there's 186,000 members. I think a good portion of those the church doesn't have any contact with at all. So if you look at the proportion of those who should be dying year on year, I don't think the church is aware of a lot of them. So I would imagine there are thousands of people who are on the membership record of the church in the UK who probably died a long time ago.
Right. Okay. And I believe, doesn't your name stay on the records for quite a long time, even after you die?
I believe it stays on the records till you're 110.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. So.
Slightly dodgy that. Sorry. Excellent. So your next bit of analysis?
So the next bit was looking at the number of units. So over the last sort of 20 years, I think there's been a really interesting trend in units. So I imagine you're slightly younger than me, but if you remember in the 90s, there was a real push to open branches in the church and lots of sort of smaller branches opened up. So there were, in the year 2000, from the information I have, there were 95 branches in the church in the UK 20 years ago. There's now 40 branches. So over half of the branches in the UK have shut. What generally that's meant is up to about 2010, 2012, the number of wards was creeping up slightly. So I think as branches were shutting, they were being consolidated into wards and some wards were opening. But since 2014, the number of wards has bit by bit started to fall again. There were no ward closures in 2020. I think COVID probably maybe prevented that as people were meeting, in church physically as often. But yeah, the number of wards has fallen. It's fallen by 11 since 2014.
Wow. And how many are there in the UK, just for reference?
279 as of 2020, yeah.
Right. So we lost 11 from nearly 300. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So not terrible losses, but, there has been a downward trend that you've spotted.
Yeah, a downward trend. Yeah, and like I said, concerning for wards, because previously the number of wards was bit by bit creeping up, but that seems to definitely turn in the last 5-6 years.
Okay. And do you reckon the church will start opening wards just for the illusion of growth, like splitting them into first or second wards or whatnot?
I would say that's unlikely because the reports that sort of I'm getting is that quite a
Hmm.
number of wards are not really big enough to be splitting at the moment. So I think
Yeah.
there's more likely to be consolidation.
Well, because I know from anecdotal experience, so in my home stake, Daventry branch got consolidated into Rugby Ward. Leicester used to have 4 wards. I
And there's
believe
three now.
now
Yeah.
there's 3. I can't think of any other areas off the top of my head where they've closed and consolidated.
Yeah,
Um,
so I'm in the north. I'm in the north of England. So
right.
Leeds Stake lost a ward 2 years
Okay.
ago, 2019. I think Ashton the Line Stake lost one the year
Hmm.
before. So yeah, there's bit by bit. There's been 1 or 2
Right.
closures recently.
Okay. Cool. And that leads us to. I'm just going to keep pushing you for the next bit because I have nothing to say
Yeah,
here
that's
other than
fine.
based off what
No,
you
that's
say.
fine. So the next one was number of meeting houses. So
Okay.
in 2020, a meeting house was sold. Not sure exactly which one that was. There's been a few instances where people have found the sort of right move listings and then sort of suggested, oh, we should all pull some money together and build a nightclub, which was
How much do
very
they tend to
interesting.
go for out of interest? Do you know off the top of your
Oh,
head?
I did remember seeing one. I think it was the one in Birmingham that was sold a few years ago. It was a couple of 100,000, I think.
Oh,
So
right.
not beyond the realms of possibility if you really
No, not
fancy
at all.
a nightclub. Yeah.
Okay, so you said the number of meeting houses are on the decline. Did you say?
Yeah, they've sold about 3, I think, in the last couple of years. Looking at the numbers.
Okay, right. So again, just it's not much on its own, but as part of this broader image, you're starting to see, yeah. And
Yeah.
maybe do you reckon that's why? Because Peter Bleakley talks a lot about Welling Ward. He talks a lot about Welling
Yes.
Ward needing a chapel, and the church is kind of selling chapels, and its wards are falling. Do you reckon that's the reason they're dragging their feet on possibly buying Welling a chapel?
I've spoke to a couple of people from Welling. I mean, I think the church will probably say that the expenses for building one will be too high,
Right.
which I know massively annoys Peter because the church does have the money, doesn't it? If
Well,
it
they absolutely
digs
do.
deep in its pocket.
Yeah, and they just
But
bought
yeah,
what's that thing called? Older Castle,
Older
is it?
Castle, yeah,
Yeah,
£100 million, yeah. So yeah,
but
they've
they
got the
can't
money
buy
if they
Welling a
if they
building.
find it. In terms of the cost benefit, I'm sure the church is looking at it and saying, well, if we buy land and then build a building in Welling, if it costs £6 million, £8 million, they're probably looking at 120 people or whatever that come out and say it's not cost efficient. But the primary purpose of the church, as is stated in the report, actually, there's pages and pages in this report about the purpose of the church is to further religion and do good to man, etc., etc. Well, building a building and providing that facility for the members of your congregation is probably, you would think, be the number one priority.
And so that's really interesting you bring that up. So in the report, the church has to state what its aim is as a charity. Does
Yes,
anyone
there's
then
several pages on this.
right? So then does the church's stated aim, does that then come under scrutiny through this report?
I don't know. I think the question will be who reads this report. Does the Charities Commission? I would imagine the Charities Commission doesn't have time to really scrutinise it because there are so many thousands of charities in the UK. But yeah, they have a stated aim of furthering their religion and doing good to people and helping disabled and helping poor and needy. And they state all this as as if it's sort of fact that this therefore happens. And they actually list a number of things that they do across the country which tick those boxes. So they've mentioned using chapels as vaccination centres, blood donations, Mormon helping hands. Some of the other programs in the community that they do.
So what we'll do is we'll loop back round at the end to this, and I'll get you to give your declarative statement. Does the church, through this report, meet its stated aim? No pressure.
Yeah, difficult. So in terms of tithing donations in the UK are around £30 million a year. Which actually, when you look at other charities in the UK, it makes the church one of the top 100 charities in the UK on income.
Really?
I remember when I first saw this, it was an article in the Guardian sort of 10 years ago, and it had a list of the top 1,000 biggest charities, and the church is well in the top 100, and it's above organisations like Shelter, that you would think is a huge and very important charity, but just based on income, the church is something like 75th, in the country on income. So it's 30 million in tithing donations and around 3 million into those other funds on the slip that you get as you look down. That tithing donation for last year was a drop of 8% on 2019. First time really that it's dropped. It dropped slightly in 2009, probably, because of the financial crisis and unemployment at the time. But generally, it's sort of been creeping up bit by bit, year on year. Not by very much, but yeah, this was quite a big drop. Probably unsurprising, really, given the fact that the majority of people were not, meeting together at church, and people weren't able, probably a lot of people weren't able to physically pay that tithing.
And you could also argue that maybe some of those elderly members that would normally be very diligent in paying their tithing either can't get there or have sadly passed away.
Yeah.
And it could be a mixture of those things. I believe, wasn't it during the pandemic that the church finally initialized here in the UK the ability to pay tithes online?
Yes, I think they did, yeah. I mean, previously, you were able to buy sort of standing order, direct debit type thing. But yeah, you can go onto the church website now and pay it. And I imagine that for the vast majority of people, they're doing it that digitally anyway. I don't think that many people put wads of notes into an envelope anymore.
Yeah, that's fair.
So yeah, that 8% drop probably wasn't much of a surprise. What I would be interested to see is what's the longer term impact going to be? What's it going to be in 2022? Once COVID's sort of largely overcome.
And it's the next couple of years that are going to be really interesting to see the impact that COVID has had and what the church's kind of bounce back looks like if it bounces back. You talk to Peter Bleakley, he'll tell you it just will never bounce back. It's nosediving off a cliff. I'm not sure that's representative of the picture. I don't know, but the figures, we'll all keep an eye on your figures to see, I think.
Yeah, it will be interesting. The next one I'll go into is the individual funds. So the other donations you can make on the slip in terms of humanitarian aid. What's really interesting is they're broken down individually. They get on the report. They get called restricted funds. So they're sort of restricted to the account that they're donated to. So keeping sort of track of those is quite interesting because certainly for a lot of them, there's not really any expenses being made. So just as an example, the Book of Mormon fund there on the slip, where you can help donate to have copies of the Book of Mormon printed, around £40,000 a year gets donated into that fund. There's been no withdrawals for over 10 years, so there's £372,000 sat there in that account. I mean, that's a lot of books. But that's not getting used at all. The one that will really, I think, annoy people is humanitarian aid. The donations are really high, I think. So it's over £500,000 a year. Most years, I mean, it has been going up over the last 10 years. But there was a small withdrawal last year, but that's the first withdrawal in 10 years. So there's currently £5 million sat in the account, or just under £5 million.
£5 million.
Yeah.
That little old dears and every member of the church has gone up to the bishop and given over as sacred funds, the widow's mite, and said, "This I want to do humanitarian aid," and the church has just kept it in an account. Do they have to say what their expenditures were on?
It doesn't. No. So there was an expenditure from the Humanitarian Aid Fund of about £190,000 on something. I'm sure during the pandemic they found something to spend it on. But yeah, that is the first expenditure from that fund in the last 10 years.
That can't go overseas, can it? Or can it? That expense?
Well, possibly. This is one of the issues with the report is there's a level of transparency, but certainly not telling us everything.
If everyone can get in the comments and look and search and find and see where that £190,000 went, or where we think it went during 2020, let's have a look at what the church did here in the UK in terms of charitable work. Let's find out, because a lot of the sort of aid that would have been given to individual members of the ward if they needed it is likely to have come from fast offering funds, right?
Yep. So
that's
each year
the way the church operates.
Virtually all gets spent. Yeah. So there's about £1.5 million a year coming in fast offering, and that's virtually all spent, as you would expect, because it is used to support members. But I would be interested to know if there's been any humanitarian projects in the UK.
Was that completely spent this year?
Virtually. There was a small surplus at the end of the year.
Right.
Yeah. So not.
So I'm just wondering if there wasn't a surplus. Some could argue that, well, they used all the tithing funds this year, and they had to dip into the humanitarian aid fund to keep helping the members. Possibly. But if there was a surplus, then that
it doesn't look like it. I can pull the exact numbers up. The income from fast offering for the year was about £1.5 million, and they spent just about 1.4 million of it. So about £100,000 left. And that added to their balance. So by the end of the year, there was £860,000 in the fast offering fund.
Okay, so still plenty in there to do whatever they would have needed to do with that humanitarian aid fund. So we still need to try and work out what that was spent on. Because I
Yeah,
think it's good for us to know, those of us with an interest in making sure the church does its best, to know actually what are they doing with that money.
I would think so. And the
Mm.
church is generally quite, they like to blow their own trumpet, don't they? So if they've spent it on some sort of fantastic project, they would
Yeah.
normally be sort of
Mm. So it's
plastering that all over
surprising that I
social
haven't
media
heard about
somewhere.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'd normally be all over the shop.
While we're on those sort
Hmm.
of small individual funds, then the Temple Construction Fund has got a balance there of £800,000. That's been accumulating over 10
Right.
years. And the Perpetual Education Fund has a balance of £1 million.
Okay. So
So
sorry,
there's a million
Scotland.
pounds.
So go on. Go on.
Yeah. So again, like you said, the church has solicited donations to that fund, sort of telling people you will be supporting education. It was predominantly the Perpetual Education Fund. It was for, South and Central American countries and the Philippines and places like that to help support, former missionaries going to university. And any money donated there in the UK in the last 10 years is just sort of sat there. There's £1 million sat there.
Not nothing really gone in or out.
No, nothing's gone out whatsoever.
Oh wow.
No expenses at all from that account.
Wow, okay. And then the temple building fund, that's another one that's also accumulated.
Yeah, so just under 900,000 is in there at the moment.
Right. Not enough
Sorry,
to
yeah,
build a temple.
815,000. No, that won't be enough to build a temple in Scotland, I'm afraid.
No.
No.
Sorry, folks. So if the church had to be transparent with their finances, it'd be interesting to see just how much money Rexburg, Idaho has, because they're clearly getting a second temple, I believe.
Yes, they are, yeah.
So,
They must be very faithful, though.
Okay, so those small pots of money, the church isn't, they're kind of doing on a smaller scale, a fraction of the scale, what they're doing with Enzyme Peak. They're pushing money into a fund and then just letting it kind of accrue and not really taking out. And it's
Yeah,
not then therefore being used for the purpose of the fund that they've set it aside for.
that's true. And unusually for the church, they're not investing it either. I think with Ensign Peak, the whole purpose is, let's make the money work as best as possible, but it is just sat there in a HSBC bank account in Solihull.
This is where it's just there,
It's just
just
there, yeah.
not doing anything, which is really quite frustrating.
And
Honest.
it is, yeah. And I mean, I'll defend the church in the UK here because I think they'll just be singing the hymn sheet from Salt Lake. If Salt Lake wanted that money, they would take that money. If they don't, it just stays there. So they're at the behest of whatever Salt Lake wants them to do with the cash.
No, absolutely right, because we are a top-down church, and so we just do what we're told. Where does the money lead us next, Kris?
So the next thing is staffing costs, which
Okay.
I've always been quite sort of shocked how high these are actually. So I mean, we all probably know some people who work for the church, particularly if you're in the Midlands, there'll be a number of people who work for the church. There's still an office in Solihull, although a lot of jobs moved to Frankfurt, didn't they? Sort of 5-6 years ago. For 2020, the amount of money spent on staff in the UK was just over £11 million. So that's about 40% of tithing income is going on to staffing costs. So quite a significant chunk of the church's spend in the UK is on
Wow.
staff.
Okay, and does that 40% figure remain consistent? Do they
It's been
proportionately?
fairly consistent. Yeah, it's been high 30s for most of the time I've been collecting the data.
Mm,
So 8-9 years ago, it used to be over 40%. So it's probably dropped slightly, but that's pretty consistent really with the last
okay.
few years.
Right. And so, how is that? Do we have access to who's being paid what?
So it does list a number of employees. So it does say how many teachers the church has, how many administrators, but it does interestingly list the numbers of people who earn over £60,000 a year. Now, I need to go back and check the previous reports because there's two sections on this, and this is just getting really boring into the report. There's a section on the number of people who earn over 60,000, and then the number who earn over 60,000 and are accruing pension benefits. So that sort of suggests to me that second category of people who are permanently contracted and are paying into the church's pension scheme, and then the first one where there's significantly more people, I think that might be consultants or people being paid for one-off projects, or maybe termination payments. It's not really 100% clear, but it's generally been around 20 people each year who are paid above 60,000. Last year it was 23 on the including those who are paying those pension benefits. But overall, there were 40 people for the whole year that got paid over 60,000.
And
But
that's a
like I said,
lot.
I think that will include some who are maybe left the employment of the church and had termination payments, or maybe they
Mm.
were contractors. But yeah, 40 people earning over £60,000 a year. I think that's a lot.
That is a lot. That's a lot of money. What's the median wage in the UK?
It's just over 30,000 the median wage, and I looked the percentile up as well, being a good mathematician. And
Yeah.
if you earn £60,000 in the UK, that puts you on the 92nd percentile for earnings.
So
So
you
this
earn more than 91% of
90,
people, or
91%
90,
of
yeah.
people, yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
So that is, I mean, that is a very good wage in this
Yeah,
country.
I should pack this
I
in
did
and
have
start working for the church, I think.
definitely, yeah, yeah. There was some comments on Reddit from an American who sort of converted that to dollars and said, well, £60,000 is $80,000. That's not that good a wage. And I think in America it depends where you live. I think maybe if you're in San Francisco, that's not a great wage, but and maybe in London it's not an incredible wage. But look, the percentile rank says it all. You
Hmm.
earn more than 91% of people in this country if you're on
Yeah,
60,000. And there were actually some that earned a lot more than that. So there were three people who earned over £100,000 a year,
really, and
which
that puts
is
them in
the
what percentile?
top 2 or 3%. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So the church clearly pays people well, whoever these people are.
Well, and that's a really good question. Who are these people? I mean, the church lists that there are 45 employed teachers in the UK, which I was surprised it was as many as that. I know there's some sort of regional CES directors.
I know one, and I don't actually know how much he earns. It'd be interesting for me to reach out and just ask him if he is one of these people.
Yeah, I've known a couple throughout my time, and I would be slightly surprised if they're on over 60. But
Okay.
I
Do you
certainly
not
don't.
think
I
it's that well
certainly
paid?
um, I never got the impression it was fantastically paid. I got the impression it was decent. Maybe they just creep into that, over 60, but they certainly won't be the ones. I mean, there are people in this list that earn over 80, over 90, over 100. Go in the comments. Who are these people? If you know anybody who works for the church in the UK and earns top whack, what did they do?
Rat him out.
Yeah,
But the most important thing here is, though, is that none of the clergy are paid. None of our leaders are paid. None of the people that make that sort of difference in our lives day to day are paid. It is the behind the scenes workers that are paid a whack of cash. So, it's not that the church can't afford to pay its clergy. Clearly, they can clearly afford to pay some people quite well. And they prioritize it to the tune of about 40% of the tithing money that they bring in. Is there any way of, just broadly on that tithing question, is there any way of working out whether we're self-sufficient with tithing or whether we're reliant on Salt Lake?
it's quite hard to tell because from about sort of 6 or 7 years ago, probably lining up with when a lot of the support staff moved to Frankfurt. The missions in the UK used to be funded centrally from Salt Lake, and they're now funded locally. Um, so Salt Lake have to send a wad of cash over each year to support the missionary program in the UK, which is actually very expensive. It dropped a little bit last year. So last year it cost about £8 million. It has been over £10 million a couple of years ago when there was a bit of a surge of missionaries. And yeah, Salt Lake sends a wad of cash over. I think without that, I think the church is probably just about treading water in terms of self-sufficiency.
And I mean, the missionary effort, let's be honest, that's not all British saints. That's a load of happy-go-lucky boys from Boise, Idaho, coming over here and having jollies for 2 years. So, the church, it's like, I'm talking our meeting houses, congregations, our activities, that sort of stuff, what little activities we do now. That's kind of, you think we're about treading water, we're about self-sufficient on that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So the staffing cost is about 40%. Probably another 40% is providing the buildings and maintaining the buildings and refurbishing them. And then there are some other expenses in terms of the temple and the family history centres. And then there's an odd one called religious education, which the major part of the religious education budget goes on staff, which maybe the CES directors that we were talking about earlier. Interestingly, just on that point on expenses, there's no obvious place in the report where ward budgets come in. And I know ward budgets aren't particularly they're not particularly huge, are they, in terms of the activities budget or anything? But there's nowhere obvious in the report where this money is given to back to the wards to run things.
Okay. So that is interesting.
So
we don't know how the wards are funded.
No, and I would be interested to know what the ward budgets are sort of these days, because I genuinely have no idea. Because I mean, if we're at say £2,000-3,000 a year, that should be with the number of units we have pushing £1 million. So that should appear in the report somewhere.
All right. Well, again, if you know, let us know in the comments. What is the average ward budget looking like here in the UK? So where to next, Kris? Where to next? We're making numbers fun.
That is just about it. So yeah, the last 2 points that I made on Reddit were to do with the things we talked about earlier. So that temple construction fund, the perpetual education fund, sort of sitting there, and then the one that, like we mentioned this earlier, the one that really got people's back up was the humanitarian aid fund, not being spent at all. Yeah,
just sat there.
Worth pointing out. Apparently, again, the
Yeah.
church has solicited these donations from the stand. There has been a great earthquake in Japan. Please donate to the humanitarian aid fund, where we can just pop your money in a bank account in Solihull. Yeah,
Really odd.
and it's sad for members because they then feel that they've made a difference. So I think this could be quite disheartening for people if they find out that they've donated this money in good faith and nothing's happened with it.
Yeah, and a scripture actually that came to mind in regards to the fact that the humanitarian aid budget is just kind of sat there is from 1 Timothy 6. It says, "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and have pierced themselves through with many sorrows." And earlier in that it says, "Supposing that gain is godliness." Just spend the money, folks. Just spend the money.
Even if they just donate it to the Red Cross, which they've done, several times in the past. There's organisations there who are, have boots on the ground, who are doing, things on the front line of humanitarian work. Give them the cash. The Red Cross know what to do with it. Doctors Without Borders know what to do with it. Stuff the money up to them.
If you're not going to do anything with it, give it to someone who will.
That is it. They were my main takeaways. You said you were going to loop around and ask me whether
yes,
a difficult question, whether I think they justify it. I'm gonna deflect the question and just say I think it's very hard for me to say.
Right.
I think it all comes down to: do you think that furthering a religion is a charitable work? And that will come down to your level of appreciation of religion.
Even though it isn't spending its dosh, and maybe it's not all about the money. What would they call us in general conference? They call us myopic, wouldn't they, for just focusing on the fact that they haven't spent $5 million of hard-earned cash from poor members. But look at all the other stuff they've done. And that's true. We have to give them credit for the good stuff they do.
Yep. And it is, in the grand scheme of things, that $5 million in the humanitarian aid fund is a drop in a very large ocean. No, that is. Thank you very much for having me on. It's always, it can be a bit boring talking about numbers the whole time, but yeah, I think this is a really important thing that people are aware of and that that gets discussed.
Absolutely. I think it's really important that we understand what the church is doing with the money that we give them, because we give it to them in good faith. And I think it's frankly quite despicable that in the US they don't have to do something like this. That in order to have their tax exempt status, they don't have to at least in some way prove that they're doing good with the money, which I think is what has allowed Enzyme Peak to build for so long.
Yeah.
Personally, if they'd had to justify it before to someone, then it wouldn't have happened. So there we are. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Make sure you go and check out what Kris has been doing on Reddit. Make sure you have a look at the spreadsheet if you're really interested in numbers. That will be linked below. And make sure to give this video a like if you liked it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye.
Ooh.